Suspicious individual detained at Gate 7. Officer Matthew Coleman radioed as he slammed the black man against the airport wall, passengers gasping and phones recording. Acting nervous, won't make eye contact, definitely hiding something. The man wasn't hiding anything except the federal credentials that would end Coleman's career in the next 60 seconds. The fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport cast harsh shadows across the polished floors as morning travelers hurried toward their gates, wheeling suitcases and clutching coffee cups. The terminal hummed with the familiar sounds of departure announcements and conversation. But at Security Checkpoint B, a different kind of tension was building. James Carter stood in line, his charcoal gray business suit pressed to perfection, his leather briefcase held with the same steady grip he'd maintained through countless federal operations. At 45, Carter moved with the measured confidence of a man who'd spent 2 decades in federal law enforcement, rising through the ranks to become one of the most respected U.S. Marshals in the service. His assignment today was routine, or should have been, a simple flight to Los Angeles to testify in a federal corruption case, nothing that should have drawn attention. But for Officer Matthew Coleman, attention wasn't about facts. It was about assumptions. Coleman had been working the airport detail for 3 years, an assignment he'd requested specifically because it gave him authority over people who couldn't fight back. Travelers who just wanted to catch their flights, who wouldn't risk missing connections to file complaints. He was 38, built like a linebacker gone soft, with the kind of swagger that came from a badge and the belief that it made him untouchable. When Coleman spotted Carter in the security line, he didn't see a federal law enforcement officer. He saw what his prejudice had trained him to see: a black man in expensive clothes who didn't belong in first class. The suit was too nice, the briefcase too professional, the bearing too confident. In Coleman's warped worldview, it all added up to one thing: trouble. Carter had noticed Coleman watching him from the moment he'd entered the security area. 20 years of federal service had given him a sixth sense for hostile surveillance, and Coleman's stare felt like a weight on his shoulders. But Carter had faced worse than a racist airport cop. He'd survived shootouts with fugitives, taken down organized crime rings, and testified against corrupt officials who made Coleman look like an amateur. A small-town bully with a badge wasn't going to ruin his morning. The line moved forward slowly. Carter placed his briefcase and shoes in the gray plastic bins, the same routine he'd performed hundreds of times at airports across the country. The TSA agent, a young woman named Sarah, processed his items with practiced efficiency. Everything was standard, everything was legal, everything should have been smooth. That's when Coleman made his move. "Excuse me, sir." Coleman's voice carried the false authority of someone who'd watched too many police procedurals. He stepped between Carter and the X-ray machine, his bulk blocking the path forward. "I need to see some identification." Carter looked up calmly, his expression neutral. "My ID is already with TSA for processing." "Not TSA identification, police identification." Coleman's hand rested on his radio, a gesture designed to intimidate. "We've had reports of suspicious activity, and you match a description." The line behind Carter had gone quiet. Other passengers craned their necks to see what was happening, their conversations dying as they sensed trouble brewing. Sarah, the TSA agent, glanced nervously between Coleman and her supervisor, unsure whether to intervene. "What description would that be, officer?" Carter's voice remained level, professional. He'd been through enough situations like this to know that escalation would only make things worse, regardless of who was at fault. Coleman's eyes narrowed. He didn't like Carter's tone. Too educated, too calm, too dignified for someone he'd already judged as guilty. "Don't get smart with me. I asked for identification. My identification is being processed by federal security." Carter gestured toward the TSA checkpoint. "If you have specific concerns, I'm sure the federal agents stationed here can address them." The mention of federal agents made Coleman's face flush. He wasn't about to be shown up by some uppity passenger who thought he could name-drop his way out of police attention. "Turn around and place your hands against the wall." "I'm sorry?" Carter's composure finally showed a crack of surprise. "On what grounds?" "Suspicion of criminal activity." Coleman stepped closer, using his size to intimidate, and now resisting a lawful order. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on Carter. He was probably the most law-abiding person in the entire terminal, with federal credentials that gave him more legitimate authority than Coleman could dream of. But he also knew that in a situation like this, being right didn't always matter. Coleman had a badge, a gun, and the kind of racial bias that could turn a routine encounter into a tragedy. "Officer, I haven't committed any crime, and I haven't resisted anything." Carter's training kicked in. De-escalation, calm communication, no sudden movements. If there's been a misunderstanding, turn around. Coleman's shout echoed through the security area, causing heads to turn from across the terminal. His hand moved to his weapon, not drawing it, but making the threat clear. Hands against the wall now. The transformation in the crowd was immediate. What had been curious glances became shocked stares. Parents pulled their children closer. Business travelers stopped in their tracks, phones already emerging to record what looked like it was about to become another viral video of police brutality. Sarah, the TSA agent, finally found her voice. "Officer Coleman, this gentleman's credentials are legitimate. He's cleared through federal—" "I don't care what your machine says." Coleman cut her off, his focus locked on Carter like a predator who'd cornered his prey. "I'm conducting a police investigation, and this individual is interfering with airport security." Carter knew he was at a crossroads. He could reveal his federal marshal credentials right now and end this farce in seconds, but something in Coleman's demeanor, the eagerness for confrontation, the casual racism masquerading as law enforcement, made him pause. This wasn't just about him. It was about every black traveler who'd been subjected to this kind of harassment, everyone who didn't have federal badges to protect them. Maybe it was time Coleman learned a lesson. "I understand you believe you're doing your job, officer," Carter said quietly, slowly turning toward the wall. "But I think you should know that this conversation is being recorded by multiple people, and that airport security cameras are capturing everything." Coleman's grin was ugly, triumphant. "Let them record. They'll see a police officer doing his job, stopping a suspicious individual who refused to cooperate with airport security." Carter placed his hands against the cool metal wall, feeling the eyes of dozens of passengers on him. His federal credentials were in his jacket pocket, inches from Coleman's searching hands. But not yet. Let Coleman dig his hole a little deeper first. "What's your name?" Coleman demanded, pressing Carter against the wall with unnecessary force. "James Carter." "James Carter, what? Where are you traveling? What's your business in Los Angeles?" "Personal travel." Carter kept his answers minimal, watching Coleman's frustration build with each professional response. Coleman's hands began searching Carter's jacket, his touch rough and invasive. When his fingers brushed against the leather credential wallet in Carter's inner pocket, he paused. "What's this?" "Business cards," Carter replied truthfully. The credential case did contain business cards, along with his federal marshal badge and identification. Coleman pulled out the leather wallet, flipping it open without really looking at it. His attention was focused on Carter's reaction, waiting for panic or pleading that never came. When he finally glanced down at what he was holding, his world tilted sideways. The gold badge caught the airport lights like a mirror, the eagle and shield design unmistakable to anyone in law enforcement. Below it, the identification card was clear and official. James M. Carter, United States Marshal, Federal Law Enforcement. Coleman's face went white, then red, then white again. His hands started to shake as the full magnitude of his mistake crashed over him like a wave. He'd just assaulted a federal law enforcement officer. He'd just committed a felony in front of dozens of witnesses and multiple cameras. "Oh shit," he whispered, the words barely audible above the terminal noise. Carter turned around slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to shout to command respect. "Officer Coleman, I'm going to need your name, badge number, and supervisor's contact information." The crowd around them had grown larger, sensing that something significant was happening. Phones were definitely recording now, capturing Coleman's moment of recognition and panic. A few passengers had started whispering among themselves, the words "Federal Marshal" rippling through the group like electricity. Coleman's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His training told him to apologize, to try to de-escalate, to find some way to minimize the damage. But his pride and prejudice warred with his self-preservation instincts, leaving him frozen in a nightmare of his own making. "I was responding to a report," he stammered, his voice lacking all the authority it had carried just moments before. "What report?" Carter's question was sharp, professional. "From whom? What specific suspicious activity was I alleged to be engaged in?" Coleman looked around desperately, as if the airport walls might provide him with an acceptable answer. The TSA agents were watching with expressions that ranged from confusion to horror. Sarah looked like she was trying to disappear into her uniform. "There was someone," said. Coleman's lies crumbled before he could even form them. The truth was that there had been no report, no suspicious activity, no legitimate reason for the confrontation beyond his own biases. Carter stepped closer, his presence suddenly much more imposing despite being physically smaller than Coleman. The federal badge was still visible in his hand, a symbol of authority that dwarfed anything Coleman represented. "Officer Coleman," Carter said, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades in federal law enforcement, "you are in very serious trouble." The words hung in the air like a sentence passed down from a judge. Around them, the airport continued its normal rhythm, but in this small circle of space, everything had changed. The hunter had become the hunted, the authority figure had become the criminal, and justice was about to begin its work. Coleman's career was over. He just didn't know it yet. But James Carter did. And as he watched the racist cop squirm under the weight of his own actions, Carter felt the familiar satisfaction that came with serving justice. This wasn't personal, it was professional. And Officer Matthew Coleman was about to learn the difference between real law enforcement and the badge-wearing bullying he'd been getting away with for years. The reckoning had begun. The silence that followed Carter's words was deafening. In the span of 30 seconds, the entire dynamic at Security Checkpoint B had shifted like tectonic plates during an earthquake. Coleman stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, panic, and desperate calculation as his brain tried to process the magnitude of his mistake. But James Carter wasn't finished. "Officer Coleman, you've just committed assault on a federal law enforcement officer," Carter said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who'd testified in countless courtrooms. "You've also violated my Fourth Amendment rights through an unlawful search and seizure, and you've interfered with federal business." He paused, letting each charge sink in. "These are felony offenses." Coleman's radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cutting through his panic. "Unit 47, status report on your detention at Checkpoint B. Airport security is requesting clarification." Coleman fumbled for his radio, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 50 people, forming a loose circle that gave them space but kept everyone within recording distance. At least a dozen phones were capturing every moment, and Carter could see passengers in the background making calls, probably to news stations, lawyers, civil rights organizations. "Unit 47, Coleman's voice cracked. "Situation is complicated." Carter held out his hand. "Give me the radio, officer." "What? No, That wasn't a request." Carter's tone shifted, becoming the voice of a federal agent giving a direct order. "Hand me the radio now." Coleman's training warred with his panic. Every instinct told him to comply with a superior law enforcement officer, but his pride and desperation made him hesitate. That hesitation lasted exactly 3 seconds before Carter solved the problem for him. Carter reached for his phone and dialed a number that Coleman couldn't see. When it connected, his voice became crisp and official. "This is Deputy U.S. Marshal James Carter, badge number 2847. I need immediate federal response to Denver International Airport, Terminal B, Security Checkpoint 7. I've been assaulted by a local law enforcement officer who is currently interfering with a federal investigation." The blood drained from Coleman's face. "Federal investigation? What federal investigation?" Carter covered the phone's microphone. "The one you just compromised by assaulting a federal officer." He returned to his call. "Yes, the officer is still on scene. Matthew Coleman appears to be with airport police detail. I'll need FBI response and my supervisor contacted immediately. Coleman finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. Look, Marshal Carter, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding, Carter interrupted, ending his call, was when you decided that my skin color was probable cause for assault. He gestured to the crowd around them. And now it's documented by approximately 15 different cameras. Sarah, the TSA agent who'd tried to intervene earlier, appeared at Carter's elbow with her supervisor, a stern-faced woman in her 50s named Janet Morrison. Morrison's expression suggested she was rapidly calculating the liability nightmare unfolding in her security area. Marshal Carter, Morrison said, having clearly been briefed on the situation, I apologize for this incident. TSA had already cleared your credentials and identification. Officer Coleman was acting outside of proper procedure. Coleman turned to Morrison, desperately. Janet, you know me. I've been working this detail for 3 years. There was a report. What report? Morrison's voice was ice cold. I've checked with our communications center. No reports of suspicious activity were filed regarding this gentleman. No alerts were issued. You acted on your own initiative. She paused, letting that sink in, against a cleared federal law enforcement officer. The radio chatter had attracted attention from other airport security personnel. 2 more uniformed officers approached the group, their expressions shifting from routine backup to horror as they recognized the federal credentials in Carter's hand and the implications of what Coleman had done. Officer Derek Mills, Coleman's usual partner, looked sick. Matt, what the hell did you do? I was doing my job. Coleman's voice rose, desperation creeping in. I saw suspicious behavior. You saw a black man in an expensive suit, Carter said quietly, and decided he didn't belong here. That's not police work, Officer Coleman. That's racial profiling, and it's illegal. The crowd was growing larger by the minute. Business travelers heading to early morning flights had stopped to watch the confrontation unfold. A family with 3 children stood near the coffee kiosk, the parents whispering urgently while trying to shield their kids from the tension. An elderly man in a veteran's cap shook his head in disgust as he watched Coleman squirm under federal scrutiny. This is insane, Coleman muttered, running his hand through his hair. I've made thousands of legitimate stops. I know when someone looks suspicious. Looks suspicious? Carter's voice carried a dangerous edge. Officer Coleman, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. What specifically about my appearance or behavior did you find suspicious? Coleman's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The question was a trap, and he knew it. Any answer he gave would either admit to racial profiling or prove he had no legitimate basis for the stop. The way you were standing in line, you kept looking around, checking the exits. I was reading the departure boards, Carter interrupted. Standard behavior for any traveler checking gate information. And you were overdressed for a casual flight. I'm traveling on federal business. Professional attire is required. You seemed nervous when I approached. I seemed cautious when a hostile police officer began racially profiling me, Carter corrected, which, given current events, was an entirely reasonable response. Each exchange drove Coleman deeper into his hole. The crowd around them was no longer just watching. They were beginning to react. Murmurs of racial profiling and abuse of power rippled through the group. Several passengers had their phones out, not just recording, but actively live-streaming the confrontation to social media. Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the Airport Police Supervisory Unit arrived next, drawn by the radio traffic and the growing crowd. Rodriguez was known for her no-nonsense approach to law enforcement and her zero tolerance for officers who brought shame to the badge. When she saw Coleman standing next to a federal marshal holding his credentials, her expression went from concerned to furious in seconds. Coleman, step away from the marshal, Rodriguez ordered. Now, detective, I can explain. You can explain it in my office after you're suspended. Rodriguez turned to Carter, her voice shifting to the respectful tone reserved for fellow law enforcement. Marshal Carter, I'm Detective Rodriguez, Airport Police Supervision. I sincerely apologize for this incident. Can you brief me on what occurred? Carter glanced around at the crowd, the cameras, the recording devices. This was the moment where he could either let this slide with an apology and a handshake, or make it a teaching moment for every law enforcement officer who thought a badge was a license for racism. He chose teaching. At approximately 9:47 a.m., I was proceeding through standard TSA security screening when Officer Coleman approached me without cause. Carter began, his voice carrying clearly to every phone recording him. He demanded identification that I had already provided to federal security. When I attempted to explain that my credentials were being processed by TSA, he became verbally aggressive and ordered me to assume a position against the wall. Coleman's face grew redder with each sentence, but he remained silent, finally understanding that anything he said would only make his situation worse. Officer Coleman then physically assaulted me by forcing me against the wall and conducting an unlawful search of my person. Carter continued, "During this search, he discovered my federal marshal credentials. At no point did I resist or act in any manner that could be construed as suspicious or threatening." Detective Rodriguez was taking notes, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. "Were there any verbal threats or statements made by Officer Coleman that you considered racially motivated?" Carter paused, glancing at Coleman before answering. "Officer Coleman referred to people like me not belonging in first-class travel. He also stated that I matched a description but was unable to provide any specifics when questioned." The crowd around them had grown quieter, but the tension had increased. Passengers were beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing police misconduct, they were watching a federal case being built in real time. Mills, Coleman's partner, cleared his throat nervously. "Detective Rodriguez, for the record, there was no alert or report that I'm aware of. Coleman initiated this contact on his own." Coleman spun toward Mills, betrayal flashing in his eyes. "Derek, you said—" "I said nothing," Mills interrupted firmly. "You saw a black man and decided he was trouble. I watched the whole thing happen." He looked at Carter apologetically. "Marshal, I should have intervened earlier. I take responsibility for that failure." The admission hit Coleman like a physical blow. His own partner was throwing him under the bus, abandoning him to save his own career. The isolation was complete. No backup, no support, no way to spin this into anything other than what it was. "Derek, we've been partners for 2 years," Coleman pleaded. "You know I'm not racist. You know I treat everyone fairly." "Do I?" Mills' voice was cold. "Because I've watched you pull over more black drivers than white ones. I've seen you question minority passengers while ignoring suspicious behavior from white travelers. I always told myself it was coincidence. But watching this," he gestured toward Carter, "this was pure racial bias, Matt, and I'm not going down with you." Public nature of Mills's abandonment sent a visible shock through Coleman. His face went pale, then flushed red with humiliation. The crowd was watching his professional and personal destruction in real time, recorded for posterity by dozens of cameras. Carter nodded acknowledgement but kept his focus on Rodriguez. "Detective, I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about me. I'm a federal law enforcement officer with the training and resources to handle this situation appropriately. But what about the next black traveler who doesn't have a badge? What about the businessman who gets profiled because he doesn't look like he belongs in first class? What about the teenager traveling alone who gets cornered by Officer Coleman?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. Rodriguez understood immediately that this wasn't going to be resolved with a quiet apology and a transfer to another detail. "Marshal Carter, I understand your concerns," Rodriguez said carefully. "The airport police department takes these allegations very seriously." "These aren't allegations," Carter interrupted, his voice hardening. "These are documented facts, recorded by multiple witnesses and captured on airport security cameras. Officer Coleman committed felony assault on a federal officer. He violated my civil rights under color of law. He interfered with federal business. These are not departmental policy violations. These are criminal acts." The gravity of Carter's words settled over the crowd like a blanket. This wasn't just about one bad cop making a mistake. This was about federal crimes, civil rights violations, and the kind of charges that destroyed careers and led to prison time. Coleman finally found his voice again, though it came out as a desperate plea. Marshal Carter, please. I have a family. 2 kids. I made a mistake. You made a choice, Carter corrected. You chose to see my skin color as probable cause. You chose to escalate a routine encounter into a physical confrontation. You chose to ignore proper procedure and TSA clearance. These weren't mistakes, Officer Coleman. They were decisions rooted in racial bias. A woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice carrying across the terminal. How many others, she called out. How many other black people has he done this to, who didn't have federal badges to protect them? The question sparked murmurs of agreement from other passengers. Carter could see the mood shifting from shock to anger, from witnessing injustice to demanding accountability. That's exactly the right question, Carter said, addressing the crowd directly. How many traffic stops based on skin color? How many airport confrontations with innocent travelers? How many times has Officer Coleman's bias been allowed to masquerade as law enforcement? Coleman's world was collapsing around him. The crowd was turning hostile. His partner had abandoned him. His supervisor was building a case against him, and a federal marshal was systematically destroying any chance he had of surviving this incident. Please, Coleman whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. Carter studied Coleman's face, looking for genuine remorse beneath the panic and self-preservation. What he saw was a man who was sorry he'd been caught, sorry he'd chosen the wrong target, sorry his career was ending, but not sorry for the years of racial bias that had led to this moment. Officer Coleman, Carter said quietly, your apology might mean something if this was an isolated incident, but we both know it's not. This is who you are, not a mistake you made. The federal backup that Carter had called for arrived at that moment. 2 FBI agents and Carter's supervisor, Deputy Chief Marshal Patricia Williams. Williams was a 25-year veteran whose reputation for fair but uncompromising enforcement was legendary throughout federal law enforcement. James, Williams said as she approached, her voice carrying both concern and authority. Are you injured? No injuries, Chief, Carter replied. But we have a situation that requires federal attention. Williams looked around at the crowd, the cameras, the clearly panicked Coleman, and the airport officials who were trying to manage what was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. Her expression suggested she understood exactly what kind of situation had developed. Agent Morrison, Agent Chen. Williams addressed the FBI agents, please document this scene and take preliminary statements from witnesses. I want everything preserved for federal prosecution. Coleman's legs nearly gave out. Federal prosecution? Williams turned to him with the kind of look that had intimidated hardened criminals for 2 decades. Officer Coleman, you've assaulted a federal law enforcement officer. Did you believe there wouldn't be consequences? Detective Rodriguez stepped forward. Chief Williams, the Airport Police Department is prepared to cooperate fully with any federal investigation. Officer Coleman will be suspended immediately, pending the outcome of your investigation. Suspended. Williams' eyebrow rose. Detective Rodriguez, this isn't a matter for administrative discipline. This is a federal criminal matter. Officer Coleman will be arrested and charged appropriately. The words hit Coleman like a physical blow. Arrest. Federal charges. His career wasn't just over. His freedom was in jeopardy. Wait, please, Coleman stammered. I can explain. There were factors. The only factor, Agent Morrison said as he approached with handcuffs, is that you committed a felony against a federal officer. He began reading Coleman the Miranda rights, his voice carrying clearly across the terminal. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Matthew Coleman, who just 20 minutes earlier had been wielding his badge like a weapon, was arrested and handcuffed by federal agents. The transformation was complete. The hunter had become the hunted, and justice was moving with the swift efficiency of federal law enforcement. Carter watched the arrest with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent his career fighting for justice. But this wasn't personal vengeance. It was systemic accountability. Coleman's arrest would send a message to every law enforcement officer who thought a badge was a license for racism. The message was simple: not anymore. As Coleman was led away in handcuffs, his head down in shame and defeat, Carter turned to the crowd of passengers who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Many were still recording, their phones capturing the moment when justice actually worked the way it was supposed to. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carter said, his voice carrying clearly across the terminal, "what you've witnessed today is what happens when the system works correctly. No one, regardless of their badge or their uniform, is above the law." The applause started slowly, with one passenger clapping, then another, until the entire terminal was filled with the sound of people celebrating justice served. But Carter knew this was just the beginning. Coleman's arrest was only the first step in what would become a much larger reckoning. The federal investigation that would follow would expose not just one racist cop, but an entire culture of bias and abuse that had been allowed to flourish in law enforcement. As the crowd began to disperse and normal airport operations resumed, Carter gathered his belongings and prepared to continue his journey to Los Angeles. But he knew that Coleman's arrest would be the story that followed him, the moment when one man's courage to stand up to injustice had started a wave of change that would ripple through law enforcement across the country. Justice had been served, but the real work was just beginning. 24 hours after Matthew Coleman's arrest at Denver International Airport, FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen sat in a windowless conference room surrounded by file boxes that painted a damning picture of systemic racism masquerading as law enforcement. The investigation into Coleman's background had revealed a pattern so clear and consistent that it read like a textbook case study in racial profiling. 17 complaints in 3 years, Agent Chen reported to the assembled federal task force. 17 documented instances of racial bias, excessive force, and unlawful detention, all dismissed by Internal Affairs as unsubstantiated or within policy guidelines. Deputy Chief Marshal Patricia Williams leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. 17 complaints that we know of. How many incidents went unreported because the victims were too intimidated, too poor, or too distrustful of the system to file formal complaints? The question hung in the air like an accusation against every law enforcement agency that had allowed Coleman's behavior to continue unchecked. Agent Morrison, who had arrested Coleman the previous day, spread several incident reports across the conference table. "Let me read you some highlights," Morrison said, his voice carrying the disgust of a career law enforcement officer confronting corruption within his own ranks. June 2023, Coleman detained Marcus Williams, a black software engineer, for suspicious behavior in an airport parking garage. Williams was retrieving his rental car after a business trip. No charges filed, no contraband found, no legitimate reason for the stop. Williams picked up another file. August 2023, Coleman forcibly removed Denise Thompson, a black attorney, from the airport VIP lounge, claiming she was trespassing. Thompson had a valid membership and was waiting for a delayed flight. The complaint was dismissed when Coleman claimed he was responding to reports of someone acting aggressively with staff. Agent Chen continued the litany. September 2023, Coleman handcuffed Dr. Robert Hayes, a black cardiologist, during a traffic stop near the airport. Coleman claimed Dr. Hayes was reaching for something when he was actually reaching for his medical identification as requested. The stop lasted 45 minutes. Dr. Hayes was released without charges after his hospital called to inquire about his whereabouts. The pattern was undeniable. Coleman hadn't just made a mistake with James Carter. He had been systematically targeting black travelers and professionals for years, using his badge to humiliate and intimidate people who had committed no crimes other than existing while black. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: Coleman's own reports. "Here's what's interesting," Agent Chen said, pulling up a laptop computer. "Coleman was required to file incident reports for every detention, every stop, every use of force. He's actually quite thorough in his documentation and completely oblivious to how clearly it reveals his racial bias." The screen displayed a spreadsheet that Agent Chen had compiled from 3 years of Coleman's official reports. The numbers were staggering. 78% of Coleman's detentions involved Black or Hispanic individuals, despite those groups representing only 23% of airport travelers. His use of force incidents were even more skewed, 85% against minorities. But here's the smoking gun. Agent Chen continued, clicking to another screen. Coleman's own language in these reports consistently describes Black suspects as aggressive, hostile, or non-compliant, while white suspects engaged in similar behavior are described as confused, cooperative, or having a bad day. Morrison shook his head in disgust. He documented his own racism and filed it with the department. How did Internal Affairs miss this pattern? The answer to that question was sitting in another stack of files, Internal Affairs investigations that had been rushed through the system, complaints that had been buried in bureaucracy, and a pattern of protecting officers like Coleman from accountability. Detective Lisa Rodriguez had been requested to attend the federal briefing, and her presence in the room represented the Airport Police Department's attempt to cooperate with the investigation. But Rodriguez's expression suggested she was learning things about her own department that horrified her. "Agent Chen," Rodriguez said quietly, "I need to see those Internal Affairs files. If what you're showing me is accurate, then my department has been systematically covering up civil rights violations for years." Williams nodded approvingly. "Detective Rodriguez, your cooperation will be noted in our report. But we need to understand how Coleman was able to operate with impunity for so long. Who was reviewing his reports? Who was investigating the complaints? Who decided that 17 allegations of racial bias were all unsubstantiated?" The federal investigation was expanding beyond Coleman to encompass the entire system that had enabled his behavior. Agent Chen pulled up another document, Coleman's personnel file from the Airport Police Department. Matthew Coleman, age 38, 11 years in law enforcement. Agent Chen read, started with the Denver Police Department, transferred to airport duty 3 years ago after what's euphemistically described as compatibility issues with community policing initiatives. Morrison looked up from his notes. Compatibility issues? Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Coleman was transferred to airport duty after several complaints about his interactions with minority communities in Denver. The transfer was presented as a promotion, but it was really a way to move him away from daily community contact. So your department knew he had issues with racial bias, and your solution was to give him authority over travelers from around the world? Williams' voice carried a dangerous edge. That's not problem-solving, Detective Rodriguez. That's enabling. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Coleman hadn't developed his racial bias at the airport. He had brought it with him, gift-wrapped with a badge and a transfer that was meant to hide the problem rather than solve it. Agent Chen clicked to another screen showing Coleman's training records. Here's something else interesting. Coleman has never completed cultural sensitivity training, diversity awareness programs, or any coursework related to civil rights law. Despite the complaints, despite the pattern, no one ever required him to undergo additional training, because that would have required admitting there was a problem, Morrison observed. It was easier to dismiss the complaints than address the behavior. The investigation had also uncovered something else disturbing. Coleman wasn't alone. Agent Chen displayed a new spreadsheet showing detention and use of force statistics for the entire airport police detail. Coleman's numbers are the most extreme, but he's not an outlier, Agent Chen explained. The entire airport police unit shows statistically significant racial bias in their enforcement patterns. Coleman was just the most blatant example of a department-wide problem. Williams leaned forward, her expression intense. Agent Chen, I want every case involving airport police reviewed for civil rights violations. I want every complaint reinvestigated with federal oversight. And I want a complete audit of their training, supervision, and accountability procedures. Rodriguez looked sick. Chief Williams, what you're describing is a complete federal takeover of our operations. Detective Rodriguez, what I'm describing is justice, Williams replied. Your department had years to address these problems internally. You chose to transfer them, ignore them, and cover them up instead. Federal intervention isn't a choice anymore. It's a necessity. The conversation was interrupted by Agent Morrison's phone, buzzing with an urgent message. He read it quickly, his expression growing grim. "We have a problem," Morrison announced. "James Carter's arrest of Coleman has gone viral on social media. Airport justice is trending nationally, and we're getting calls from victims' rights groups, civil rights organizations, and congressional offices. The pressure for a comprehensive investigation is mounting." Williams nodded grimly. "The public attention changes our timeline. We need to move fast to get ahead of this story." She turned to Rodriguez. "Detective, I need a complete list of every officer who worked with Coleman, every supervisor who reviewed his reports, and every internal affairs investigator who cleared his complaints. I need it by end of business today." "Chief Williams, that kind of information is evidence in a federal civil rights investigation." Williams cut her off. "Detective Rodriguez, your department can cooperate voluntarily, or we can obtain federal subpoenas and seize the records. Your choice." Rodriguez understood the implications immediately. Voluntary cooperation might minimize the federal takeover of her department. Resistance would guarantee it. "I'll have the files transferred to you within 2 hours, Rodriguez agreed. Agent Chen pulled up another document on her laptop. "There's something else we need to discuss." Coleman's arrest at the airport was captured by multiple cameras and recorded by dozens of witnesses. But that's not the only incident that's been documented. The screen showed a YouTube video with over 2 million views. Security camera footage of Coleman forcibly removing Dr. Denise Thompson from the VIP lounge 8 months earlier. The video had been posted by another passenger who had witnessed the incident, and the comments section was filled with stories from other travelers who claimed to have been harassed by Coleman. "Social media is becoming our biggest investigative tool," Agent Chen continued. "Passengers who were afraid to file formal complaints are now posting their experiences online. We have video evidence, witness testimonies, and a growing database of Coleman's victims who are willing to cooperate with federal prosecution." Morrison scrolled through the video comments on his tablet. "Listen to this one. Officer Coleman made me empty my entire purse in front of everyone at security. He claimed I was acting nervous, but I was just trying to catch a flight to my father's funeral. He made me miss the flight and treated me like a criminal the entire time. I'm a retired school teacher with no criminal record." Williams closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the human cost of Coleman's behavior. How many lives has this man damaged? How many people have been humiliated, traumatized, or worse, because we allowed a racist with a badge to operate unchecked? The federal investigation was revealing something larger than one corrupt cop. It was exposing a system that had repeatedly chosen institutional protection over individual justice. Every dismissed complaint, every transferred officer, every buried report represented a failure of leadership that had enabled Coleman's reign of terror to continue for years. Agent Chen brought up another spreadsheet, this one showing the financial cost of Coleman's behavior. The city has paid out $347,000 in settlements related to Coleman's actions over the past 3 years, all settled quietly, with non-disclosure agreements that prevented the victims from speaking publicly about their experiences. "Hush money," Morrison said bluntly. The city was paying to cover up civil rights violations rather than stopping them. Rodriguez looked like she was going to be sick. "I had no idea the scope was this extensive. I reviewed individual cases, but I never saw the pattern because it was spread across different units, different time periods." "Detective Rodriguez," Williams interrupted, "ignorance isn't an excuse for failure to act. The pattern was there for anyone who wanted to see it. The problem is that no one in your department wanted to see it." The meeting was interrupted by Agent Chen's phone ringing. She answered briefly, her expression growing more serious with each word. "That was the U.S. Attorney's Office," Agent Chen announced after ending the call. "They want a preliminary report on our findings within 48 hours. The Attorney General's office is taking a personal interest in this case, and they're considering making it a test case for federal prosecution of law enforcement civil rights violations." Williams smiled grimly. Coleman picked the wrong federal marshal to assault. James Carter's reputation in law enforcement is sterling. His testimony is unimpeachable, and his arrest is documented by multiple sources. This case is going to be the Justice Department's poster child for police accountability. The investigation was expanding in real time. fueled by public outrage and federal determination to make an example of Coleman and the system that had protected him. But as the scope of the corruption became clear, Williams realized they were dealing with something much larger than one racist cop. They were dealing with a culture of impunity that extended throughout law enforcement, a system that had consistently chosen to protect officers over the people they were sworn to serve. Coleman's arrest wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape policing in Denver and beyond. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams said, addressing the assembled task force, "we're not just investigating Matthew Coleman anymore. We're investigating every person, every department, and every official who enabled his behavior. This is about more than one federal marshal being assaulted. This is about civil rights, constitutional law, and the fundamental question of whether badges are licenses for racism." The room fell silent as the magnitude of their investigation became clear. Coleman's 32nd assault on James Carter had opened a door that exposed years of systematic abuse, institutional racism, and the failure of oversight that had allowed it all to continue. Justice was coming for Matthew Coleman, but he wouldn't be facing it alone. As the meeting concluded and the task force members gathered their files, Agent Chen remained behind to review the evidence one more time. The numbers were stark, the pattern undeniable, and the human cost immeasurable. Coleman had spent 3 years terrorizing innocent travelers, and the system had spent 3 years looking the other way. But not anymore. Federal law enforcement was taking over, and with it came the kind of accountability that Coleman and his enablers had managed to avoid for too long. The investigation was just beginning, but Agent Chen could already see how it would end, with justice served, systems reformed, and a clear message sent to every law enforcement officer in America that racism wearing a badge was still just racism. And in America, that was still a crime. 48 hours after his arrest, Matthew Coleman sat in a sterile federal holding cell, his life collapsing with the systematic precision of a controlled demolition. The man who had wielded his badge like a weapon against innocent travelers now wore an orange jumpsuit and faced the very system he thought would always protect him. But the worst revelation was yet to come. Federal Marshal James Carter stood outside the interview room at the Denver Federal Building, reviewing the classified file that would destroy what remained of Coleman's world. The mission that had brought Carter to Denver International Airport wasn't coincidence. It was a carefully planned federal operation that Coleman had unwittingly walked into like a lamb to slaughter. Operation Clean House, Carter said to FBI agent Sarah Chen as they prepared for Coleman's interrogation. 18 months of planning, federal resources from 3 agencies, and Coleman just handed us the perfect entry point into the entire airport corruption network. Agent Chen reviewed her notes one final time. So Coleman's assault on you wasn't just a random act of racism. It was the trigger we needed to launch the comprehensive investigation? Carter nodded grimly. The Justice Department has been tracking civil rights violations at Denver International for 2 years. We had complaints, we had patterns, but we needed someone to cross the line so clearly that federal intervention became undeniable. He paused, looking through the interview room window at Coleman, who sat slouched in his chair like a broken man. Coleman gave us that line when he assaulted a federal officer in front of 50 witnesses. The federal investigation had moved with breathtaking speed once Coleman's arrest provided the legal framework for comprehensive action. In less than 48 hours, federal agents had executed search warrants, seized records, and begun interviewing witnesses that painted a picture of corruption that extended far beyond one racist cop. Agent Morrison joined them outside the interview room, carrying a thick file of evidence that would seal Coleman's fate. We've got him cold on the federal charges: assault on a federal officer, civil rights violations under color of law, conspiracy to deprive citizens of constitutional rights. But that's just the beginning. Carter studied Coleman through the one-way mirror. The man looked smaller than he had at the airport, his aggressive confidence replaced by the hunted look of someone who finally understood the magnitude of his situation. Coleman's attorney, a public defender named Michael Torres, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, sat beside his client, reviewing federal charges that could result in decades in prison. "Before we go in there," Carter said to his federal colleagues, Coleman needs to understand exactly who he assaulted and why. He needs to know that his 30 seconds of racist aggression just destroyed a multi-year corruption network. Agent Chen smiled grimly. The irony is perfect. Coleman's hatred of black people is what brought down the entire system he was part of. The federal task force entered the interview room with the confidence of prosecutors who knew they held all the cards. Coleman looked up as they entered, his eyes immediately focusing on Carter with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that maybe somehow the federal marshal might show mercy. "Officer Coleman," Carter began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 20 years building federal cases. "Do you understand the charges against you?" Coleman's attorney, Torres, spoke first. "Marshal Carter, my client, is prepared to cooperate with your investigation in exchange for consideration on sentencing." "Mr. Torres," Carter interrupted, "your client is in no position to negotiate. He assaulted a federal law enforcement officer in front of multiple witnesses while engaging in a pattern of civil rights violations that spans years. Cooperation isn't going to save him. It might just keep him out of maximum security." Coleman finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Marshal Carter, I know I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I have a family." "Officer Coleman," Carter said, pulling out his classified mission file, "I want you to understand something. My presence at Denver International Airport wasn't coincidence. I wasn't just another passenger you decided to harass because of the color of my skin." Coleman's face went pale as Carter opened the federal file marked Operation Cleanhouse, Classified. For the past 18 months, the United States Department of Justice has been conducting a comprehensive investigation into civil rights violations, corruption, and systematic abuse of power at Denver International Airport, Carter continued. "Your assault on me was the final piece of evidence we needed to launch federal prosecution against the entire network." The words hit Coleman like physical blows. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about his arrest. This was about a federal operation that had been building a case against him and his colleagues for over a year. "You mean you were investigating us before?" Coleman stammered. "We were investigating a pattern of civil rights violations that you were at the center of," Agent Chen interjected. 17 complaints in 3 years, Coleman. 17 documented instances of racial profiling, excessive force, and abuse of power. Did you really think the federal government wasn't paying attention?" Coleman's attorney looked sick as he realized the scope of the federal case against his client. "Marshal Carter, if this was a planned operation, then my client—" "Your client walked into a federal investigation and committed a felony against the investigating officer," Carter said. "Mr. Torres, this isn't entrapment. This is justice." Agent Morrison spread several photographs across the interview table. Security camera images of Coleman's previous encounters with minority travelers. Each image told a story of abuse. Each caption documented another violation of civil rights. "Marcus Williams, June 2023. Morrison read. "Detained for 45 minutes for suspicious behavior in the parking garage. No charges filed. No contraband found." Dr. Denise Thompson, August 2023. "Forcibly removed from the VIP lounge for trespassing, despite valid membership." Dr. Robert Hayes, September 2023. "Handcuffed during a traffic stop for reaching for something when he was retrieving medical identification." Each name made Coleman sink deeper into his chair. These weren't random encounters. They were documented federal evidence of systematic civil rights violations. "But the real revelation, Coleman," Carter said, leaning forward, "is that you weren't working alone. The federal investigation has identified a network of airport police, TSA supervisors, and security personnel who have been systematically targeting minority travelers for harassment, detention, and abuse." Coleman's eyes widened in panic. "I don't know anything about a network. I was just doing my job." "Your job was to provide security, not to racially profile innocent travelers," Agent Chen interrupted. "But you and your colleagues turned the airport into a hunting ground for anyone who didn't fit your idea of what passengers should look like." The federal file contained evidence that went far beyond Coleman's individual actions. Wiretapped conversations between airport personnel, email exchanges discussing problem passengers, encoded racial language, and financial records showing how the corruption network had been profiting from civil forfeitures and illegal searches. Officer Coleman, Carter continued, the federal investigation has uncovered financial irregularities, falsified reports, and a systematic pattern of targeting wealthy minority travelers for asset forfeiture. This isn't just about racism, it's about organized crime wearing police badges. Coleman's world was collapsing in real time as each revelation destroyed another pillar of his defense. This wasn't just about one bad encounter. It was about years of criminal activity that the federal government had been documenting with the patience of professional prosecutors. Torres whispered urgently with his client before addressing the federal agents. What kind of cooperation are you looking for? Agent Morrison smiled coldly. Complete cooperation. Names, dates, financial records, communication logs. We want every detail of how this corruption network operated, who was involved, and how the profits were distributed. And if my client cooperates? Torres asked. He'll still go to federal prison, Carter said bluntly, but the difference might be 10 years instead of 25. Coleman's face crumpled as the reality of his situation became undeniable. His career was over, his freedom was forfeit, and his family would pay the price for his years of racist abuse. The federal charges alone carried enough prison time to ensure he'd be an old man before he saw freedom again. The irony, Coleman, Carter said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction, is that your hatred is what brought you down. If you had just processed me through security, like any other passenger, Operation Clean House would have taken months longer to build its case. But you couldn't help yourself. You saw a black man in an expensive suit and decided he needed to be taught a lesson. Coleman looked up with tears in his eyes. I'm not a racist. I never meant. Officer Coleman, Carter interrupted, we have 17 documented victims who would disagree with that assessment. We have recordings of you using racial slurs. We have evidence of you specifically targeting minority travelers while ignoring suspicious behavior from white passengers. You are exactly what a racist looks like. The federal investigation had also uncovered Coleman's personal communications, including text messages and social media posts that revealed the depth of his racial animosity. Agent Chen pulled out printouts of Coleman's Facebook posts, tweets and private messages that painted a picture of a man consumed by racial hatred. These people think they can just waltz through our airport like they own the place. Agent Chen read from one of Coleman's messages. Someone needs to teach them some respect. That was your text message to another officer after detaining Dr. Thompson. Coleman's attorney read through the evidence with growing horror. The federal case wasn't just strong. It was overwhelming. Text messages, recorded conversations, video evidence, financial records, and witness testimony created a web of evidence that would be impossible to challenge in court. Marshal Carter, Torres said finally, what exactly do you want from my client? Carter leaned back in his chair, studying Coleman with the expression of a federal agent who had spent 20 years building cases against criminals. Mr. Torres, what we want is justice. For Marcus Williams, for Dr. Thompson, for Dr. Hayes, and for every other innocent traveler who was victimized by your client's racism. But we also want the network, Agent Morrison added. Coleman was a foot soldier in a larger operation. We want the supervisors who covered up his crimes, the administrators who transferred him instead of firing him, and the officials who paid settlements to silence his victims. Coleman finally spoke, his voice breaking. If I cooperate, if I tell you everything I know, what happens to my family? Carter's expression softened slightly. Officer Coleman, your family are victims too. They're victims of your choices, your racism, and your criminal behavior. Cooperation won't change what you've done, but it might help them rebuild their lives while you're serving your federal sentence. The interview continued for 3 more hours as Coleman slowly began to unravel the corruption network that had protected and enabled his behavior for years. Names of supervisors who had ignored complaints, administrators who had falsified reports, and officials who had orchestrated cover-ups emerged as Coleman realized that cooperation was his only hope for any kind of mercy. But as the federal agents gathered their evidence and prepared to expand their investigation, Coleman understood that his assault on James Carter had accomplished something he never intended. It had triggered the complete destruction of the racist system he had been part of. "Officer Coleman," Carter said as the interview concluded, "you asked me earlier if I was racist. Let me answer that question now. I'm not racist. I'm justice. And justice doesn't care about the color of your skin when you violate the constitutional rights of American citizens." Coleman was led back to his federal holding cell, but the investigation was just beginning. The federal task force now had the cooperation of a key insider and the legal authority to dismantle the entire corruption network that had turned Denver International Airport into a hunting ground for racist abuse. As Carter reviewed the day's revelations, he felt the satisfaction that came with a mission accomplished. Operation Clean House was proceeding exactly as planned, and Coleman's assault had provided the perfect catalyst for federal intervention. Justice was being served, one arrest at a time, and Matthew Coleman, who had thought his badge made him untouchable, was learning that in America, no one is above the law, especially those who swear to uphold it. 1 week after Coleman's arrest, the Denver Federal Building had become the nerve center of the largest civil rights investigation in Colorado's history. Operation Clean House had exploded from a single assault case into a comprehensive takedown of institutional racism that reached into every corner of Denver International Airport's law enforcement apparatus. Federal Marshal James Carter stood before a wall-mounted map studded with red pins, each one representing a victim of the corruption network that Coleman had begun to expose. 17 pins had become 43 as more victims came forward, emboldened by news coverage and federal protection. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, extending far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. "Coleman gave us the key to the kingdom," FBI agent Sarah Chen reported to the assembled federal task force, her voice carrying the satisfaction of an investigator who had uncovered systematic corruption. 3 supervisors, 7 officers, 2 TSA administrators, and a civilian contractor involved in asset forfeiture fraud. The corruption network was generating over $2 million annually through illegal searches, false arrests, and civil asset seizures. Deputy Chief Marshal Patricia Williams studied the financial flowchart that Agent Morrison had constructed from Coleman's cooperation and seized records. The chart looked like a spiderweb of corruption, with money flowing from victims to corrupt officials through a sophisticated system of kickbacks and profit sharing. They weren't just racist, they were entrepreneurs. They turned racial profiling into a profit center, a systematic business model built on civil rights violations. The federal investigation had uncovered a sophisticated criminal enterprise masquerading as law enforcement. The network specifically targeted wealthy minority travelers, using racial profiling to identify victims who were likely to carry significant cash or valuable items. False drug investigations provided cover for asset seizures, while intimidation and threats prevented most victims from filing complaints or seeking legal recourse. "Here's how it worked," Agent Chen explained, pointing to a detailed flowchart mounted on the conference room wall. Coleman and other officers would identify high-value targets, usually Black or Hispanic travelers in expensive clothing or carrying luxury items. They'd manufacture probable cause for searches, find legal items like prescription medications or large amounts of cash, then claim suspicious circumstances warranted seizure under civil forfeiture laws. Carter reviewed a victim impact statement that made his stomach turn with its detailed account of systematic abuse. Dr. Patricia Newman, cardiac surgeon from Atlanta. Coleman seized $27,000 in cash she was carrying to purchase medical equipment for a charity clinic in Mexico. The money was never returned, and she was threatened with drug charges if she filed complaints. 3 months later, she discovered the seized money had been distributed among airport police officers as performance bonuses. The corruption network had operated with stunning audacity, protected by supervisors who shared in the profits and a city administration that preferred paying settlements to addressing systematic problems. Coleman's cooperation had provided the federal government with detailed financial records, communication intercepts, and testimony that painted a picture of organized crime, wearing police badges and exploiting the public trust. Williams turned to Agent Morrison, her expression grim as she contemplated the scope of prosecutions that would be required. Status on the arrest warrants? 15 federal indictments, signed by the grand jury this morning, Morrison reported. consulting his tablet. We're executing simultaneous arrests at 6 a.m. tomorrow. Airport Police Supervisor, Lieutenant Daniel Nash, Officers Bradley Werner and Michael Santos, TSA Administrator Patricia Collins, and 11 others involved in the conspiracy. The U.S. Attorney's Office is calling it the largest law enforcement corruption case in state history. Coleman's transformation from defiant racist to cooperating witness had been swift and complete, driven by the reality of spending decades in federal prison and the complete destruction of his family's financial security. Faced with mountains of evidence and the prospect of life behind bars, he had provided investigators with a detailed roadmap to the entire corruption network, including financial records, communication logs, and specific details about hundreds of illegal activities. Coleman's cooperation has been extensive and verifiable. Agent Chen continued, reviewing the stack of statements and evidence that the former officer had provided. He's given us recordings, financial documents, and detailed testimony about specific incidents going back 3 years. The evidence is overwhelming: bank records, wire transfers, victim testimonies, and electronic communications that document every aspect of the criminal enterprise. Carter studied Coleman's written statement, 47 pages of confessions that read like a manual for systematic civil rights violations and organized crime. The level of detail was stunning, revealing not just individual acts of corruption, but the sophisticated systems that had been developed to maximize profits while minimizing exposure. Listen to this excerpt. Lieutenant Nash told us that minority passengers were easy targets because they were less likely to complain and more likely to carry cash. He said the city would rather pay settlements than deal with bad publicity, so we could operate with minimal oversight as long as we kept the individual amounts below 50. The federal investigation had also uncovered the crucial role of city officials in enabling and protecting the corruption network. Settlements, totaling over $800,000, had been paid to victims over 3 years, all with non-disclosure agreements that prevented public awareness of the systematic abuse. The city's legal department had become actively complicit in the cover-up, treating civil rights violations as a manageable cost of doing business rather than serious crimes requiring prosecution and reform. Williams reviewed another set of federal warrants, her expression darkening as she read the charges. We're also arresting City Attorney Mark Richardson and Deputy City Manager Susan Clark for conspiracy to violate civil rights and obstruction of justice. They knew about the pattern of abuse, received detailed reports about the financial irregularities, and chose to cover it up rather than stop it. Richardson personally negotiated 17 settlements with victims, while never once referring any cases for criminal prosecution. The scope of the federal takedown was unprecedented in Colorado history and represented a new level of federal intervention in local law enforcement corruption. 18 arrests across multiple agencies, asset seizures totaling $3.2 million, and a complete federal takeover of airport security operations. The message was clear and unambiguous. Institutional racism would be met with institutional accountability, regardless of how deeply embedded it had become in local systems. Agent Morrison's phone buzzed with an urgent message from the field teams positioned around the city. He read it quickly, his expression growing concerned. "We have a problem. News of tomorrow's arrests has leaked to local media. Channel 7 is reporting that federal agents are preparing to arrest multiple airport officials for civil rights violations. Some targets may already be attempting to flee or destroy evidence." Carter grimaced as he considered the implications of compromised operations. "How much of the operation is blown?" "Unknown at this point," Morrison replied, checking his secure communication device. "But we need to assume that some targets will attempt to flee, destroy evidence, or contact co-conspirators to warn them. The element of surprise has been compromised." Williams made a decision that would accelerate the entire investigation and demonstrate the federal government's commitment to swift justice. "Move up the timeline immediately. Execute all arrest warrants within the next 2 hours. I want federal agents at every location before the targets have time to react to the news coverage." The federal task force scattered like a precision military unit responding to an emergency situation. Agent Chen coordinated with FBI field teams positioned around the city, providing updated intelligence and target locations. Morrison contacted federal prosecutors to expedite additional warrants and ensure that legal procedures were followed, despite the accelerated timeline. Carter prepared to personally arrest Lieutenant Nash, the supervisor who had overseen and profited from Coleman's racist activities for 3 years. At Denver International Airport, Lieutenant Daniel Nash was concluding what he thought was a routine shift, completely unaware that federal agents were already positioned around the building and monitoring his activities. Nash had spent the week trying to distance himself from Coleman's case, claiming complete ignorance of his subordinates' behavior, despite overwhelming evidence that suggested active participation and supervision of the corruption network. Nash's phone rang as he prepared to leave his office for what would be the last time as a free man. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Matthew Coleman, calling from federal detention with information that would shatter Nash's world. "Danny, they're coming for you tonight," Coleman whispered urgently into the phone, his voice barely audible above the background noise of the federal facility. "The feds know everything about our operation, the financial records, the recordings, the victim lists, the profit-sharing arrangements. They have it all documented." Nash's blood turned to ice as the full implications of Coleman's words sank in. "What exactly did you tell them, Matt?" "I told them the truth about everything," Coleman replied, his voice breaking with desperation. "About the targeting system we developed, about the profit-sharing arrangements, about your orders to focus on minority passengers with expensive luggage, about the monthly meetings where we planned which flights to focus on. Danny, they're going to arrest you tonight, and they have enough evidence to put you away for 20 years. The phone line went dead as federal agents confiscated Coleman's communication privileges. But the damage had been done. Nash now knew that his carefully constructed 3-year criminal enterprise was collapsing around him, and that federal law enforcement had detailed evidence of his leadership role in the conspiracy. Nash immediately began destroying evidence with the desperation of a man who understood that his freedom depended on eliminating proof of his crimes. He shredded financial documents, deleted files from his computer, and attempted to contact other members of the network to warn them about the impending federal action. But federal agents had been monitoring his activities for hours, and his desperate attempt at evidence destruction was being recorded by sophisticated surveillance equipment. 20 minutes later, James Carter and 3 FBI agents entered Nash's office with arrest warrants and a comprehensive search warrant that would seize everything Nash was trying to hide. The timing was perfect. Nash was caught in the act of destroying evidence, which would add additional federal charges to his already lengthy list of crimes. "Lieutenant Daniel Nash," Carter announced with the authority of someone who had spent 20 years bringing corrupt officials to justice, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, fraud, racketeering, and obstruction of justice under federal law." Nash looked up from his document shredder, his face pale with shock, and his hands still holding evidence he'd been trying to destroy. "Marshal Carter, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about my role in—" "The only misunderstanding," Carter interrupted, gesturing to the federal agents who were documenting Nash's evidence destruction, "was thinking that federal law enforcement wouldn't eventually catch up with your criminal enterprise. Your subordinate Coleman has provided us with detailed testimony about your leadership role in this conspiracy." As federal agents handcuffed Nash and read him his Miranda rights, Carter felt the deep satisfaction that came with dismantling systematic corruption and delivering justice for victims who had suffered in silence. Nash had supervised Coleman's racist activities, personally shared in the profits from illegal seizures, and actively covered up civil rights violations for years. His arrest represented justice for dozens of victims who had been terrorized by the network he had helped create and profit from. Across the city, similar arrests were taking place with military precision and coordination. Officer Bradley Werner was arrested at his home as he tried to flee with suitcases full of cash and gold coins purchased with proceeds from the corruption network. TSA Administrator Patricia Collins was taken into custody at her office while attempting to delete records from federal computers and destroy hard drives containing evidence of the conspiracy. Deputy City Manager Susan Clark was arrested at an upscale restaurant where she was meeting with expensive lawyers to discuss potential plea agreements and asset protection strategies. The coordinated federal takedown was proceeding with the efficiency of a well-planned military operation. each arrest dismantling another piece of the corruption network that had operated with virtual impunity for years. Local news stations began reporting on the unprecedented federal operation, their cameras capturing federal agents leading handcuffed officials from buildings across Denver in what became known as the Denver Airport Corruption Roundup. Back at the federal building, Agent Chen coordinated the massive evidence seizure operation that accompanied the arrests. 47 computers, 32 cell phones, 18 vehicles, and approximately $400,000 in cash seized from personal residences. The financial evidence alone will support comprehensive racketeering charges against the entire network. We've also recovered offshore banking records and evidence of money laundering through various shell companies. Carter reviewed the arrest reports as they came in throughout the evening, each one representing another victory for the victims who had suffered under the corruption network's systematic abuse. But he knew that arrests were only the beginning of a long process. The real work would be prosecuting the cases, recovering assets for victims, and ensuring that comprehensive justice was served for every person who had been victimized by the conspiracy. Williams addressed the task force as news of the arrests spread across local and national media, creating a firestorm of coverage about federal intervention in local law enforcement corruption. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've accomplished today represents the largest civil rights enforcement action in Colorado history and one of the most comprehensive federal responses to institutional racism in recent memory. 18 arrests, multiple federal agencies involved, and a complete dismantling of institutional racism masquerading as legitimate law enforcement. But the most significant arrest was yet to come, and it would demonstrate the federal government's commitment to prosecuting corruption at the highest levels. City Attorney Mark Richardson, who had orchestrated the legal cover-up of hundreds of civil rights violations over 5 years, was arrested at his suburban home as he prepared to board a private jet to a non-extradition country with his family. Federal agents seized his passport, travel documents, and offshore financial records that revealed the true scope of his participation in the conspiracy and his personal enrichment from the corruption. Richardson was the architect of the legal cover-up that allowed this network to operate for years, Agent Morrison reported, reviewing the evidence seized during Richardson's arrest. His legal department processed 127 settlements related to airport police misconduct over 5 years, all with non-disclosure agreements specifically designed to prevent public awareness of the systematic abuse and protect the officers involved from criminal prosecution. Carter studied Richardson's arrest photo, a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit who had sworn to uphold the law but had instead perverted it to protect criminals wearing badges and profit from their crimes. How many victims suffered in silence because Richardson chose to pay them off rather than prosecute the officers who violated their constitutional rights? How many more victims could have been prevented if he had done his job instead of enabling the corruption? The question hung in the air like a comprehensive indictment of every official who had chosen institutional protection over individual justice and public safety. The federal investigation had revealed that Richardson's office had developed sophisticated legal strategies to minimize government liability while maximizing secrecy, turning civil rights violations into cold cost-benefit calculations rather than serious crimes requiring justice and accountability. As the day concluded and the last arrest warrant was executed successfully, Carter reflected on the magnitude of what Operation Clean House had accomplished in just 1 week. Coleman's 30-second racist assault had triggered the complete destruction of a criminal network that had operated for years with virtual impunity, protected by corrupt supervisors and enabled by complicit city officials. But the investigation was far from over, and Carter knew that the real test would come in the courtrooms where justice would ultimately be served. Federal prosecutors were preparing cases that would send corrupt officials to prison for decades. Civil rights attorneys were filing comprehensive lawsuits that would bankrupt the agencies that had enabled the abuse, and congressional investigators were demanding hearings into how such systematic corruption had been allowed to flourish under federal oversight. Williams assembled the task force for a final briefing, as news reports showed footage of the arrests playing across national media, creating a narrative of federal accountability that would resonate across the country. What we've done today sends a clear and unambiguous message to every law enforcement agency in America. Racism wearing a badge is still racism. Corruption wearing a uniform is still corruption, and both will be prosecuted with the full force of federal law and resources. The federal takedown had exceeded every expectation, dismantling not just individual corruption, but the institutional systems that had protected and enabled systematic abuse for years. Coleman's racist assault on James Carter had inadvertently triggered the most comprehensive civil rights enforcement action in decades, creating a precedent for federal intervention that would reshape law enforcement accountability across the country. Justice was being served with unprecedented speed and scope. But Carter knew that the real victory would come when the systematic changes prevented future victims from suffering the abuse that had characterized Denver International Airport and similar institutions for far too long. As federal agents processed evidence and prepared comprehensive prosecution files, Carter allowed himself a moment of satisfaction mixed with determination for the work ahead. Operation Clean House had accomplished its primary mission. Systematic corruption had been met with systematic accountability, and the message was clear to every law enforcement officer in America. No one was above the law. Not anymore. And the federal government had the resources and determination to prove it. 6 months after the federal arrests that dismantled the Denver International Airport corruption network, the Alfred A. Araj United States Courthouse had become the epicenter of the most significant civil rights trial in Colorado's history. The case of United States v. Coleman had expanded into a comprehensive prosecution of 18 defendants, but Matthew Coleman remained the symbolic face of institutional racism meeting federal justice. Federal Marshal James Carter sat in the witness stand, his federal credentials and 2 decades of law enforcement service lending unshakable credibility to his testimony. The packed courtroom hung on every word as he methodically destroyed what remained of Coleman's defense, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dedicated his career to upholding the very laws Coleman had violated. Officer Coleman approached me without any legitimate law enforcement purpose, Carter testified, his eyes locked on the federal jury. His actions were motivated entirely by racial bias. He saw a black man in professional attire and decided I didn't belong in that airport terminal. What followed was a systematic violation of my constitutional rights and a federal crime. Coleman sat at the defendant's table, looking like a shadow of the arrogant officer who had assaulted Carter 6 months earlier. His expensive suit couldn't hide the weight loss, the stress lines, or the haunted expression of a man whose world had completely collapsed. His wife had filed for divorce, his children had been removed from private school due to financial hardship, and his house was in foreclosure as legal fees consumed what remained of his assets. Defense attorney Michael Torres, who had initially hoped for a plea bargain, was now fighting a hopeless battle against overwhelming federal evidence. Marshal Carter, Torres began his cross-examination. Isn't it possible that my client was simply following airport security protocols? Mr. Torres, Carter interrupted, his voice calm but firm. There were no protocols that authorized your client to racially profile passengers, physically assault them, or conduct unlawful searches. What your client did was commit federal crimes, and no amount of legal maneuvering will change those facts. The federal prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez, had spent months building an ironclad case that went far beyond Coleman's assault on Carter. Financial records, recorded conversations, victim testimonies, and Coleman's own cooperation had created a web of evidence that painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into every level of airport law enforcement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Martinez addressed the court during her opening statement. This case is about more than one racist police officer making a bad decision. This is about a criminal conspiracy that turned law enforcement into a profit center, civil rights violations into business opportunities, and public service into personal enrichment. The trial had become a national sensation, with civil rights organizations, law enforcement reform advocates, and media representatives filling every available seat in the courtroom. The case represented a watershed moment in federal civil rights enforcement, demonstrating that institutional racism would be met with systematic accountability, regardless of how deeply embedded it had become in local systems. Dr. Patricia Newman, the cardiac surgeon whose $27,000 had been seized by Coleman, took the witness stand with the dignity of someone who had survived systematic abuse and lived to seek justice. Her testimony was devastating in its detail and emotional impact, revealing the human cost of the corruption network's activities. Officer Coleman treated me like a criminal from the moment he saw me, Dr. Newman testified, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional toll. He didn't see a doctor traveling to help children in Mexico. He saw a black woman with money, and he decided I was a target. The humiliation, the fear, the knowledge that my skin color made me guilty in his eyes, that's something I'll carry for the rest of my life. Coleman's attorney attempted to challenge Dr. Newman's account, but the evidence was overwhelming. Security camera footage, Coleman's own reports, and financial records showing the distribution of seized assets among network members created an undeniable record of criminal activity that stretched back years. Marcus Williams, the software engineer who had been detained for suspicious behavior while retrieving his rental car, delivered testimony that revealed the systematic nature of the targeting. Coleman didn't just harass me, he studied me. He watched how I dressed, where I traveled, what kind of car I drove. He was profiling successful black travelers as potential targets for his criminal enterprise. Each victim's testimony added another layer to the prosecution's case, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse that had operated under the protection of corrupt supervisors and complicit city officials. The emotional impact on the jury was visible, with several members taking notes as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Lieutenant Daniel Nash's trial was proceeding simultaneously in an adjacent courtroom, and his testimony as a cooperating witness had provided federal prosecutors with detailed insight into the leadership structure of the corruption network. Nash's plea agreement required him to testify against his co-conspirators, but it also revealed his central role in organizing and profiting from the systematic abuse. Coleman reported directly to me. Nash testified during his own sentencing hearing. I knew about the racial profiling. I approved the targeting strategies, and I personally received monthly payments from the seized assets. I'm not trying to minimize my role. I was the architect of a criminal enterprise that victimized innocent travelers for years. Nash's cooperation had been extensive, but came at a personal cost that mirrored Coleman's destruction. His wife had committed suicide 3 months after his arrest, unable to cope with the public shame and financial ruin that followed the federal investigation. His teenage children had been placed in protective custody after receiving death threats from victims' families and civil rights activists who viewed Nash as the face of institutional racism. The financial scope of the corruption network became clear during the asset forfeiture hearings that ran parallel to the criminal trials. Federal investigators had traced over $3.2 million in illegal proceeds, including offshore accounts, real estate purchases, and luxury items purchased with money stolen from innocent travelers. Agent Sarah Chen testified about the sophisticated money laundering operation that had allowed the network to operate for years without detection. The defendants didn't just steal money, they created an entire financial infrastructure to hide their crimes. Bank accounts in multiple states, shell companies, cryptocurrency transactions, and real estate investments designed to conceal the source of their illegal income. The evidence presented during the asset forfeiture hearings revealed that Coleman alone had received over $180,000 in illegal proceeds over 3 years, money that had been used to purchase a luxury truck, fund private school tuition for his children, and make improvements to his suburban home. The contrast between his lifestyle and his official salary had been so obvious that federal investigators later questioned how internal affairs had failed to detect the financial irregularities. City Attorney Mark Richardson's trial had become a separate spectacle, focusing on the legal cover-up that had enabled the corruption network to operate with virtual impunity. Richardson's sophisticated legal strategies to minimize government liability while protecting corrupt officers had created a blueprint for institutional corruption that extended far beyond Denver. Richardson wasn't just covering up individual crimes, testified FBI agent Morrison during Richardson's trial. He was systematically perverting the legal system to protect a criminal enterprise. Every settlement he negotiated, every non-disclosure agreement he drafted, every case he refused to prosecute was part of a comprehensive strategy to enable civil rights violations. Richardson's defense team had attempted to argue that he was simply following standard legal procedures, but federal prosecutors produced evidence showing that he had personally profited from the corruption through legal fees, political contributions from police unions, and business relationships with other conspirators. The trials had also revealed the broader scope of institutional failure that had allowed the corruption to flourish. Internal affairs investigators who had dismissed legitimate complaints, city officials who had ignored obvious red flags, and federal oversight agencies that had failed to detect systematic civil rights violations all came under scrutiny during the proceedings. Coleman's final day of testimony as a cooperating witness was perhaps the most devastating moment of the entire trial. Facing decades in federal prison and the complete destruction of his life, he provided a detailed confession that laid bare the racist motivations behind his criminal behavior. "I targeted black passengers because I thought they were easy victims," Coleman testified, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "I thought their skin color made them less likely to complain, less likely to be believed, and less likely to have the resources to fight back. I was wrong about everything, and I destroyed innocent people's lives because of my racism." The confession was devastating, not just for its honesty, but for its revelation of the calculated nature of the systematic abuse. Coleman hadn't just made impulsive decisions. He had developed targeting strategies, victim selection criteria, and operational procedures designed to maximize profits while minimizing accountability. Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez used Coleman's confession to demonstrate the institutional nature of the corruption during her closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Coleman's testimony reveals that this wasn't a case of a few bad apples. This was a systematic criminal enterprise that perverted law enforcement into a tool of racial oppression and financial exploitation." The jury deliberations lasted only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges against Coleman. The reading of the verdict was met with applause from victims' families and civil rights advocates who had packed the courtroom galleries. But Coleman's reaction was perhaps the most telling. He simply sat in silence, finally understanding that his decades of racist behavior had led to complete personal and professional destruction. Judge Patricia Morrison, who had presided over the entire prosecution, delivered Coleman's sentence with the gravity appropriate to such a significant civil rights case. "Officer Coleman, you violated your oath, betrayed the public trust, and systematically abused innocent citizens based on their race. The federal sentence of 18 years in prison reflects not just your individual crimes, but the institutional damage you caused to law enforcement and civil rights." The sentence was longer than Coleman's attorney had hoped for, but shorter than the maximum penalties that federal guidelines allowed. Coleman would be eligible for parole in 12 years, meaning he would be nearly 50 years old before potentially regaining his freedom. His federal conviction also meant the loss of all law enforcement benefits, pension rights, and the permanent prohibition from any government employment. The broader prosecutions had yielded similar results across the network. Nash received 15 years for his leadership role, while other officers received sentences ranging from 3 to 12 years depending on their level of participation. City officials like Richardson faced their own federal sentences, creating a comprehensive accountability that extended throughout the corruption network. But the most significant impact of the prosecutions wasn't the individual sentences, it was the systematic changes that followed. The federal consent decree that governed Denver International Airport's operations had created new oversight mechanisms, training requirements, and accountability standards that fundamentally altered how law enforcement operated at the facility. Civil rights attorney David Chen, who had represented multiple victims in federal lawsuits, summarized the broader impact during a press conference following the final sentencing. "These prosecutions represent more than individual justice. They represent a fundamental shift in how federal law enforcement approaches institutional racism. The message is clear. Systematic civil rights violations will be met with systematic federal accountability." The financial impact on Coleman personally had been devastating beyond the federal sentence. The civil lawsuits filed by victims had resulted in personal judgments totaling over $2.3 million, effectively ensuring that Coleman would face financial consequences for the rest of his life. His house had been sold to pay legal fees, his vehicles had been seized for asset recovery, and his children's education funds had been liquidated to satisfy court judgments. Coleman's wife, Jennifer, had filed for divorce immediately after his federal conviction, citing the complete breakdown of trust and the financial devastation that his criminal behavior had caused their family. In her divorce proceedings, she testified about the emotional abuse she had suffered as Coleman's racist behavior had escalated over the years. Matthew became a different person after he joined the airport detail, Jennifer testified during divorce proceedings. He would come home talking about dealing with certain types of people and how he was cleaning up the airport. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but the federal investigation made it clear that my husband had become a criminal who was destroying innocent people's lives. The divorce proceedings had also revealed the extent to which Coleman's criminal behavior had infected his personal relationships. Text messages and recorded conversations showed that he had brought his workplace racism home, teaching his children to view minorities with suspicion and normalizing racist attitudes that had damaged his family's social relationships. As Coleman was led away in federal custody to begin his 18-year sentence, James Carter watched from the courtroom gallery with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice served. The assault that had lasted 30 seconds had triggered a federal investigation that dismantled systematic corruption, held institutions accountable, and sent a clear message about the consequences of racism in law enforcement. But Carter also understood that the real victory wasn't Coleman's imprisonment. It was the systematic changes that would prevent future victims from suffering the abuse that had characterized Denver International Airport for too long. The federal oversight, the reformed training programs, the new accountability mechanisms, and the cultural shift in law enforcement represented the true legacy of Operation Clean House. The prosecutions had taken 18 months to complete, but they had resulted in comprehensive justice that extended far beyond individual sentences. Victims had received financial compensation, corrupt officials had been held accountable, and institutional systems had been reformed to prevent future abuse. As Carter left the courthouse for the final time, he reflected on the magnitude of what had been accomplished. Coleman's racist assault had been intended to humiliate and intimidate, but it had instead triggered the most comprehensive civil rights enforcement action in Colorado history. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the system had been changed, and that change would protect countless future travelers from the kind of systematic abuse that Coleman and his network had inflicted for too long. The reckoning was complete, but the work of ensuring equal justice under law would continue, and James Carter would be there to make sure it did. 1 year after Coleman's sentencing, the impact of United States v. Coleman had rippled across American law enforcement like seismic waves, fundamentally altering how federal authorities approached institutional racism and civil rights violations. What had begun as a single assault at Denver International Airport had evolved into a national blueprint for accountability that reached police departments, airports, and federal agencies from coast to coast. Federal Marshal James Carter stood before a packed auditorium at the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia, addressing 300 law enforcement executives who had come to understand that the Coleman case represented more than individual justice. It was a paradigm shift that demanded institutional transformation across American policing. The Coleman case taught us that individual accountability is meaningless without systematic change. Carter told the assembled chiefs, sheriffs, and federal supervisors, "We can arrest corrupt officers, prosecute criminal behavior, and send racist cops to prison. But unless we address the institutional cultures that create and protect these individuals, we're simply treating symptoms while ignoring the disease." The audience listened with the intensity of professionals who understood that their careers, their departments, and their communities were being reshaped by federal enforcement priorities that had emerged from Coleman's 30-second assault. The Justice Department had made civil rights enforcement a cornerstone of federal law enforcement policy, with the Coleman prosecution serving as both a warning and a template for future interventions. Attorney General Lisa Warren had used the Coleman case to launch the most comprehensive civil rights enforcement initiative in decades, creating specialized federal task forces in 12 major cities to investigate patterns of institutional racism in local law enforcement. The program, officially titled the Civil Rights Accountability Initiative, had already resulted in federal investigations in Chicago, Atlanta, Phoenix, and 8 other metropolitan areas. What we learned from Denver, Warren explained during a televised press conference that had been watched by millions of Americans, is that systematic civil rights violations don't happen in isolation. They require institutional support, supervisory approval, and cultural acceptance. The Coleman Network operated for years because entire systems chose to enable rather than prevent racial discrimination. The federal response had been swift and comprehensive. Congress had passed the Law Enforcement Accountability Act, which created mandatory federal oversight for any police department with 3 or more substantiated civil rights violations within a 2-year period. The legislation also established federal funding for community oversight boards, independent investigation units, and victim compensation programs. Dr. Patricia Newman, the cardiac surgeon whose money Coleman had stolen, had become one of the most powerful advocates for police reform in the country. Her foundation, Equal Justice Under Law, had grown from a small victim support group into a national organization that provided legal assistance, advocacy training, and political support for police accountability measures. The Coleman case showed us that individual victims can become agents of systematic change. Dr. Newman explained during a speech at Howard University Law School. My experience with racial profiling and theft by corrupt officers was devastating personally, but it became the foundation for ensuring that other families wouldn't suffer the same abuse. The Equal Justice Under Law Foundation had documented over 300 similar cases across the country, revealing that the Denver airport corruption network was far from unique. Their research had identified patterns of racial profiling, asset forfeiture abuse, and institutional cover-ups in airports, border crossings, and traffic enforcement units from California to Florida. Marcus Williams, the software engineer who had been one of Coleman's earliest victims, had leveraged his technology background to create a revolutionary police accountability platform called Badge Watch. The smartphone application allowed citizens to record police interactions, automatically upload footage to secure cloud servers, and connect victims with legal resources in real time. Technology can be the equalizer in police accountability, Williams explained during a demonstration of the Badge Watch system at a civil rights conference in Washington, D.C. When Officer Coleman assaulted Marshal Carter, dozens of people recorded the incident with their phones. That documentation was crucial for prosecution, but imagine if every police interaction was automatically documented and preserved. The Badge Watch application had been downloaded over 2 million times in its first year, creating a comprehensive database of police interactions that civil rights attorneys, federal investigators, and community advocates could access for pattern analysis and legal evidence. The system had already been used as evidence in over 40 federal civil rights cases across the country. But perhaps the most significant impact of the Coleman case was its effect on police training and recruitment practices. The federal law enforcement training centers had completely redesigned their civil rights curriculum, making the Coleman prosecution a mandatory case study for all federal agents and requiring annual recertification on constitutional policing standards. Every federal agent now studies the Coleman case as an example of how individual bias can destroy lives, careers, and institutional credibility, explained Training Director Rebecca Martinez, who had prosecuted Coleman and later joined the Federal Training Administration. We use Coleman's own testimony, victim impact statements, and the financial cost of corruption to demonstrate that civil rights violations are not just morally wrong, they're professionally suicidal. The training programs had expanded beyond federal agencies to local police departments, many of which had voluntarily adopted the Coleman curriculum after recognizing that federal oversight was preferable to federal intervention. Police academies in 37 states now required cadets to study the Coleman case and complete extensive training on implicit bias, constitutional law, and community relations. Denver International Airport had become a model for reformed law enforcement practices, with the federal consent decree creating oversight mechanisms that had been copied by airports, transit systems, and police departments across the country. The transformation was so comprehensive that civil rights organizations now pointed to Denver as an example of how federal intervention could produce lasting positive change. The Denver airport went from being a symbol of institutional racism to a model of accountability and community policing, observed civil rights attorney David Chen during a review of the federal consent decree's effectiveness. Traffic stops are down 60%, complaints have dropped by 80%, and passenger satisfaction surveys show dramatic improvements in law enforcement interactions. The federal oversight had required Denver to implement comprehensive data collection systems that tracked every police interaction by race, gender, age, and outcome. The resulting statistics revealed the true scope of the racial disparities that had characterized airport policing before the Coleman case exposed the systematic nature of the abuse. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Washington, Coleman's replacement as airport police supervisor, had implemented community policing strategies that emphasized de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and accountability transparency. Her background as a military police officer with extensive civil rights training had brought a professional perspective that contrasted sharply with the corrupt culture that Coleman and Nash had created. Our mission is public safety through constitutional policing, Washington explained during a tour of the airport's new Community Relations Center. Every officer understands that racial profiling is not just prohibited, it's counterproductive to legitimate law enforcement objectives. We've learned that treating all citizens with dignity and respect actually makes us more effective at identifying real security threats. The statistical transformation at Denver International was remarkable. Minority passenger complaints had dropped from an average of 43 per month before Coleman's arrest to fewer than 3 per month under the federal oversight program. Use of force incidents had decreased by 75%, while arrest rates for serious crimes had actually increased as officers focused on legitimate law enforcement rather than racial harassment. Congressional hearings had examined the broader implications of the Coleman case, with federal lawmakers using the prosecution to justify expanded civil rights enforcement funding and stronger accountability measures for local police departments. The House Judiciary Committee had held extensive hearings on institutional racism in law enforcement, with Coleman's victims providing powerful testimony about the human cost of systematic civil rights violations. The Coleman Network stole more than money from innocent travelers, testified Dr. Newman during congressional hearings. They stole our faith in equal justice, our trust in law enforcement, and our belief that the system would protect us rather than victimize us. Restoring that faith requires more than individual prosecutions. It requires institutional transformation. The congressional hearings had also revealed the financial cost of institutional racism, with government economists calculating that civil rights violations cost taxpayers over $1.4 billion annually in settlements, legal fees, federal interventions, and lost economic activity. The Coleman case alone had cost Denver over $12 million in legal expenses, settlements, and federal oversight costs. Senator Patricia Johnson, who had chaired the Judiciary Committee hearings, used the Coleman case to advocate for federal legislation that would make civil rights training mandatory for all law enforcement officers and create financial incentives for departments that achieved measurable improvements in community relations. The Coleman case proves that investing in civil rights training and accountability measures is not just morally right, it's financially essential, Senator Johnson explained during debate on the Law Enforcement Accountability Act. Cities and counties cannot afford to ignore institutional racism when the federal consequences include comprehensive oversight, criminal prosecutions, and civil liability that can bankrupt entire departments. International observers had also taken notice of the Coleman case, with law enforcement agencies in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia studying the federal response as a potential model for addressing institutional racism in their own systems. The case had been featured in academic conferences, police training programs, and civil rights symposiums around the world. The Coleman prosecution represents a new standard for federal civil rights enforcement that other democracies are watching carefully, observed Professor Michael Thompson of the International Association of Police Chiefs. The systematic approach to accountability, the comprehensive nature of the investigation, and the lasting institutional changes demonstrate that federal intervention can produce meaningful reform. The ripple effects had also reached other federal agencies beyond law enforcement. The Transportation Security Administration had implemented new training programs based on lessons learned from the Coleman case, while Customs and Border Protection had revised their passenger screening procedures to prevent racial profiling at international entry points. Coleman himself had become an involuntary symbol of accountability from his federal prison cell in Colorado. His case was now taught in law schools, police academies, and civil rights training programs as an example of how individual racism could destroy lives, careers, and institutional credibility. Letters from students, researchers, and reform advocates arrived regularly at the federal prison, many asking Coleman to reflect on his crimes and their broader implications. In a rare interview with a criminal justice researcher, Coleman had expressed remorse that seemed genuine but also revealed the depth of his previous racism. "I destroyed innocent people's lives because I couldn't see past their skin color," Coleman admitted during the recorded interview. "I thought being a police officer gave me the right to judge people based on my prejudices, but all it did was turn me into a criminal who happened to wear a badge." The interview had been used in training programs across the country, with Coleman's own words serving as a powerful warning about the consequences of racist policing. His 18-year federal sentence had become a benchmark for civil rights prosecutions, demonstrating that federal authorities were prepared to impose serious consequences for systematic constitutional violations. James Carter had continued his federal law enforcement career, but had also become a sought-after speaker and consultant on civil rights enforcement and police accountability. His experience with the Coleman case had made him a national expert on institutional racism and federal intervention strategies. The Coleman case taught us that individual courage can trigger systematic change. Carter reflected during a speech at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's annual convention. "My decision to stand up to Coleman's assault was personal, but the federal investigation that followed became institutional. That's the power of federal civil rights enforcement. Individual justice can become community transformation." Carter's role in the Coleman case had earned him numerous awards and recognition from civil rights organizations, law enforcement agencies, and federal officials. But he was most proud of the systematic changes that had emerged from his 30-second encounter with a racist cop at an airport security checkpoint. The Coleman case had also influenced federal prosecution strategies in other civil rights cases. The comprehensive approach that had dismantled the Denver corruption network, financial investigation, institutional analysis, victim outreach, and systematic accountability had become a template for federal prosecutors handling police misconduct cases across the country. We learned from Coleman that individual prosecutions are insufficient unless they address the systems that create and protect corrupt officers, explained Deputy Attorney General Michael Rodriguez during a Justice Department training conference. Effective civil rights enforcement requires institutional diagnosis and systematic treatment, not just individual accountability. The long-term impact of the Coleman case continued to evolve as new research, training programs, and accountability measures emerged from the lessons learned during the federal investigation. Law enforcement executives, civil rights advocates, and community leaders across the country recognized that the case had fundamentally altered the landscape of police accountability and federal civil rights enforcement. But perhaps the most significant measure of the Coleman case's impact was statistical. Civil rights complaints against federal law enforcement agencies had decreased by 37% in the year following Coleman's prosecution, while voluntary participation in civil rights training programs had increased by over 200% among local police departments. The message was clear to law enforcement officers across America. The federal government was serious about civil rights enforcement. The consequences for institutional racism were severe and lasting, and the Coleman prosecution was just the beginning of a new era of accountability that would reshape American policing for generations to come. As Carter reviewed the first anniversary reports documenting the Coleman case's national impact, he felt the satisfaction that came with seeing individual justice transformed into systematic change. Coleman's assault had lasted 30 seconds, but its consequences would protect civil rights for decades to come. The ripple effect was complete. But the work of ensuring equal justice under law would continue, and the Coleman case would serve as both a warning and an inspiration for every law enforcement officer who swore an oath to protect and serve all Americans, regardless of the color of their skin. Justice had not only been served, it had been institutionalized. And that transformation would be Coleman's lasting legacy, though not the one he had intended to create. 2 years after Matthew Coleman's federal conviction, the transformation of American law enforcement accountability had become so comprehensive that a new generation of police officers was entering the profession with fundamentally different expectations about civil rights, community relations, and the consequences of racist behavior. The Coleman Standard as it had become known in law enforcement circles, represented more than individual accountability. It represented institutional evolution. Federal Marshal James Carter stood in the same Denver International Airport terminal where Coleman had assaulted him, but the atmosphere was completely different. The federal oversight program had transformed not just policies and procedures, but the entire culture of law enforcement at the facility. Officers now underwent monthly civil rights training, community liaisons participated in daily briefings, and comprehensive data collection systems tracked every interaction to ensure constitutional compliance. The transformation has been remarkable, observed Dr. Angela Washington, the independent monitor appointed by the federal court to oversee Denver's compliance with the consent decree. We've gone from a system that enabled systematic racism to one that actively prevents it. The Coleman case didn't just punish individual officers, it created institutional antibodies against future civil rights violations. The statistical evidence of transformation was overwhelming. Racial disparities in airport policing had virtually disappeared, with traffic stops, searches, and arrests now reflecting the demographic composition of airport travelers rather than the racial biases of individual officers. Complaint rates had dropped to the lowest levels in the airport's history, while passenger satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in law enforcement interactions. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Washington, who had replaced Coleman as airport police supervisor, had institutionalized the reforms through comprehensive training programs, community engagement initiatives, and accountability measures that made racial profiling virtually impossible. Her leadership had turned Denver International Airport into a model that other facilities across the country were studying and implementing. We've learned that constitutional policing isn't just about avoiding lawsuits, it's about effective law enforcement, Washington explained during a tour of the airport's new Community Relations Center. When officers treat all passengers with dignity and respect, they're more likely to receive cooperation, identify real security threats, and build the community trust that makes everyone safer. The Community Relations Center represented a revolutionary approach to airport policing, with civilian advocates available 24 hours a day to assist passengers who felt they had been treated unfairly. The center also housed a comprehensive database of police interactions that allowed real-time analysis of patterns that might indicate emerging problems before they became systematic violations. Carter's role had evolved beyond individual law enforcement to institutional consulting, with federal agencies, police departments, and civil rights organizations seeking his expertise on accountability systems and reform implementation. His experience with the Coleman case had made him a national authority on the intersection of individual courage and systematic change. The Coleman case taught us that transformation requires both bottom-up courage and top-down accountability, Carter explained during a speech at the International Association of Chiefs of Police annual conference. Individual officers must be willing to stand up to racism and corruption, but institutions must create systems that support and protect that courage rather than punishing it. Carter's consulting work had taken him to police departments across the country, helping them implement accountability measures before federal intervention became necessary. His approach emphasized proactive reform over reactive prosecution, though the threat of Coleman-style federal investigations remained a powerful motivator for voluntary compliance. The Coleman case had also fundamentally altered federal prosecution strategies for civil rights violations. The Justice Department had created specialized units focused on institutional racism, with prosecutors trained specifically to identify and dismantle systematic corruption networks, rather than just prosecuting individual crimes. The comprehensive approach that had exposed the Denver airport corruption had been refined and standardized for use across the country. We no longer wait for systematic abuse to reach crisis levels before intervening, explained Assistant Attorney General Rebecca Martinez, who had prosecuted Coleman and later joined the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. The Coleman model allows us to identify patterns early, intervene proactively, and prevent the kind of institutional corruption that victimized dozens of innocent travelers in Denver. The federal government had also created financial incentives for voluntary compliance, with grant programs that provided funding for police departments that achieved measurable improvements in civil rights performance. The carrot and stick approach had proven more effective than prosecution alone, encouraging institutional change rather than simply punishing individual violations after they occurred. Matthew Coleman's imprisonment had become a powerful symbol of accountability, but his cooperation with ongoing federal investigations had continued to produce results even from behind bars. His detailed knowledge of police corruption networks had helped federal investigators identify similar patterns in other cities, leading to additional prosecutions and reforms that extended the Coleman legacy far beyond Denver. Coleman's cooperation has been instrumental in exposing police corruption in 7 other cities, revealed FBI agent Sarah Chen during a Justice Department briefing on ongoing civil rights investigations. His insider knowledge of how these networks operate has allowed us to identify warning signs and intervention points that prevent systematic abuse from developing. Coleman's federal sentence was being served at a minimum security facility in Colorado, where he had become an unlikely advocate for police reform through his participation in educational programs and victim impact sessions. His transformation from racist officer to remorseful cooperator had been documented by researchers studying the psychology of institutional racism and individual accountability. Coleman's case demonstrates that even officers who engage in systematic civil rights violations can acknowledge their crimes and contribute to prevention efforts, observed Dr. Michael Thompson, a criminologist who had studied the Coleman case extensively. His willingness to cooperate and educate others represents a form of restorative justice that benefits both victims and the broader law enforcement community. The educational impact of the Coleman case had extended far beyond law enforcement training to academic curricula, community education programs, and civil rights advocacy initiatives. Law schools across the country now taught the Coleman prosecution as a landmark case in federal civil rights enforcement, while police academies used Coleman's own testimony to illustrate the consequences of racist policing. Dr. Patricia Newman's Equal Justice Under Law Foundation had expanded to become one of the most influential police accountability organizations in the country, with chapters in 43 states and a legal advocacy program that had successfully prosecuted dozens of civil rights cases based on lessons learned from the Coleman investigation. The Coleman case gave us a blueprint for systematic accountability that we've been able to replicate across the country, Dr. Newman explained during the Foundation's annual conference. Individual victims can become agents of institutional change when they have the support and resources to demand justice rather than just accept settlements. The Foundation's research had documented over 800 cases of police misconduct that followed patterns similar to the Denver airport corruption, revealing that Coleman's network was part of a much larger problem of institutional racism in American law enforcement. Their advocacy had contributed to federal investigations in 12 cities and legislative reforms in 27 states. Marcus Williams' Badge Watch application had evolved into a comprehensive police accountability platform used by civil rights organizations, legal advocates, and community groups across the country. The system now included automatic incident reporting, legal resource connections, and real-time analysis capabilities that helped identify patterns of misconduct before they reached crisis levels. Technology has become a force multiplier for police accountability, Williams explained during a demonstration of the latest BadgeWatch features. When every police interaction can be documented, analyzed, and shared, it becomes much harder for systematic abuse to operate in the shadows. The transparency that technology provides is the best protection against the kind of corruption that Coleman represented. The BadgeWatch platform had been credited with providing evidence in over 200 civil rights cases, creating a comprehensive database of police interactions that researchers, advocates, and federal investigators could access to identify patterns and trends. The system had also been adopted by police departments that wanted to monitor their own officers' compliance with constitutional standards. Congressional oversight of police accountability had intensified following the Coleman case, with federal lawmakers using the prosecution to justify expanded civil rights enforcement funding and stronger oversight mechanisms for local law enforcement. The Law Enforcement Accountability Act had created mandatory federal review processes for any police department with documented patterns of civil rights violations. The Coleman case proved that federal intervention could produce lasting positive change without undermining legitimate law enforcement, explained Senator Patricia Johnson during a review of the legislation's effectiveness. The key is early intervention and comprehensive reform rather than waiting for systematic abuse to reach criminal levels. The international impact of the Coleman case had continued to grow, with law enforcement agencies, civil rights organizations, and government officials from around the world studying the federal response as a potential model for addressing institutional racism in their own systems. The case had been featured in academic conferences, international law enforcement training programs, and human rights symposiums across 6 continents. The Coleman prosecution represents a new standard for democratic accountability that transcends national boundaries, observed Professor Elizabeth Mueller of the International Association for the Study of Police Accountability. The systematic approach to civil rights enforcement and institutional reform provides a template that other democracies can adapt to their own legal and cultural contexts. Carter's international consulting work had taken him to police academies, government agencies, and civil rights organizations in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and 12 other countries seeking to implement Coleman-style accountability measures. His expertise had become a diplomatic resource, with the State Department incorporating police accountability training into international development and democracy promotion programs. The financial impact of the Coleman Standard had also become a powerful motivator for voluntary compliance, with insurance companies offering reduced premiums for police departments that achieved civil rights certification and federal grants providing funding for accountability programs that met national standards. The economic incentives had proven as effective as legal penalties in encouraging institutional reform. Police departments have learned that investing in civil rights training and accountability measures is not just morally right, it's financially essential, explained Municipal Insurance Association Director Robert Chen during an industry conference. The Coleman case demonstrated that the cost of systematic civil rights violations can bankrupt entire departments, while proactive compliance programs actually reduce liability and improve community relations. The transformation of police recruitment and training had been perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the Coleman case. Police academies now required extensive civil rights education, psychological screening for racial bias, and ongoing education about constitutional policing standards. The changes had attracted a more diverse and better educated generation of officers who understood that community service rather than racial enforcement was their primary mission. We're seeing a fundamental shift in the type of person who wants to become a police officer, observed Police Academy Director Maria Rodriguez during a review of recruitment trends. The Coleman case and its aftermath have made it clear that modern policing requires officers who can work with diverse communities, respect constitutional rights, and understand that accountability is a professional requirement rather than a burden. The new generation of police officers was entering the profession with completely different expectations about civil rights, community relations, and the consequences of misconduct. They had studied the Coleman case as cadets, understood the federal oversight mechanisms that could result from constitutional violations, and embraced accountability as a professional standard rather than an external imposition. Carter's ongoing work with federal law enforcement had focused on identifying and preventing the kind of systematic corruption that had characterized the Denver airport network. His experience with the Coleman case had made him an expert at recognizing early warning signs of institutional racism and developing intervention strategies that addressed problems before they required federal prosecution. The goal is to prevent the next Coleman case, rather than just prosecute it after innocent people have been victimized, Carter explained during a training session for federal investigators. Early intervention and systematic prevention are more effective than reactive prosecution, though the threat of Coleman-style consequences remains essential for ensuring compliance. The preventive approach had proven successful, with federal civil rights complaints decreasing by 43% in the 2 years following Coleman's conviction. Police departments across the country had voluntarily implemented accountability measures, training programs, and oversight mechanisms to avoid the kind of federal intervention that had transformed Denver. As Carter reflected on the 2-year anniversary of Coleman's assault, he was struck by the magnitude of change that had emerged from 30 seconds of racist aggression. The individual crime had triggered institutional transformation that protected civil rights for millions of Americans and established new standards for police accountability that would endure for generations. The Coleman case had proven that individual courage could indeed trigger systematic change, that federal civil rights enforcement could produce lasting reform, and that accountability was not just possible but essential for legitimate law enforcement. The legacy was institutional rather than personal, systematic rather than individual, and permanent rather than temporary. Standing in the same airport terminal where Coleman had assaulted him, Carter could see evidence of transformation everywhere. Officers interacting respectfully with diverse travelers, community liaisons facilitating positive police-citizen relationships, and accountability systems ensuring that constitutional violations were prevented rather than punished after the fact. The new standard was not just about avoiding Coleman-style prosecutions. It was about creating law enforcement institutions that served all Americans with dignity, respect, and constitutional compliance. The transformation had required individual courage, federal intervention, community advocacy, and institutional commitment, but the result was a fundamental shift in American policing that protected civil rights while enhancing public safety. Coleman's assault had lasted 30 seconds, but its consequences would protect constitutional rights for decades to come. The new standard was established, the institutional changes were permanent, and the legacy of justice would continue to evolve as new generations of law enforcement officers embraced accountability as a professional calling rather than a legal requirement. James Carter's mission continued, but the Coleman case had established a foundation for equality under law that would endure long after the individual participants had moved on to other challenges. The new standard was not just about police accountability. It was about American democracy's commitment to protecting the constitutional rights of every citizen, regardless of the color of their skin. Justice had been served, institutions had been transformed, and the American promise of equal protection under law was stronger because one federal marshal had refused to accept racist abuse and one corrupt officer had faced the full consequences of his crimes. The Coleman Standard was established. The new era of accountability had begun, and the work of ensuring justice for all Americans would continue with the systematic foundation that 30 seconds of courage had created.